Started. There are a lot of things I'd like to share with you this morning, and I was reminded by several people already this is the last chance I have to talk about this. So I've got at least 4.5 or 5 hours of presentation to share with you, so we better go ahead and get started. A couple of things I need to say right off. Several of you were here on Wednesday evening and you got a copy of resources, that is books and films, that might be helpful to you if you want to explore more persons, more events in that particular event called the Holocaust. If you didn't get a copy already, I've got some ones up here that are sitting on the dresser over there adjacent to me. So I tried to circulate among you a little bit this morning and pass those out. If you didn't get one, they're on the dresser over here to my right. Speaking of things that are here, our sexton, Vince Plotzik, traveled to some of the places that we've talked about in the last, my goodness, 8 previous presentations to this one. You've got to be getting very tired of me at the least, and maybe sick of me at the most. But anyway, some of those places we talked about, Vince visited, and he was kind enough to bring his scrapbooks and place them on the table up here. So after we're finished this morning, if you'd like to have a look at his scrapbooks and the photos contained therein, please do so. And the last thing I'm going to say before we officially get started is a series of thank yous. First off, and most notably, thanks to all of you for coming to these presentations. Several of you have made every single one of them, and that certainly gets you a gold pin for attendance. I grew up Baptist, and we used to always get pins for our attendance, and by golly, you deserve gold pins for being at these particular events. So first off, thanks to all of you. Second off, thanks to the staff here at First Pres who are willing to accept and endorse and support this program. This is not an easy topic for us to be talking about. The staff recognized that, but they also said this becomes very necessary about which to speak. And I want to thank also very much Tamara, who has been with me taping all of these things. So if you've missed one, you can pick it up on the website of the church. She's done a very good job of, I believe she's videotaped every single thing that we have done. So I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful to my new technological friend, Professor Gardner from Lander, who at the very instant moment that something wouldn't work up here, it was freezing, he would rush up here and he would try to correct it. And remember that passage from Isaiah that's talking about God, and it says, my thoughts are not your thoughts and my ways are not your ways. I thought that was really restricted to God. It's also my computer. Its ways are not my ways and its thoughts are not my thoughts. And I asked Mr. Gardner, I said, what is going on with my computer? And he said, I don't know. He was able to fix it. He said, I don't know. So my computer goes in this coming, I think it's Wednesday or Thursday, to a computer company here in town that's going to look at my computer and see what in the world is going wrong, what's going on with my particular computer. Let's see if I thanked everyone I want to thank. Well, I need to thank the University of South Carolina also. The Holocaust exhibit, Anna Frank exhibit that we had here for a month, that we took down yesterday with the help of Brad Christie and Gordon Tubbs, and our pastor showed up just at the last minute in time to carry a few things from here out to the car. So I want to thank those persons as well for their work. And I will tote that exhibit back to the University of South Carolina tomorrow morning. So thanks to the church for allowing that exhibit to be here in Alexander Hall, but also for granting the rental fee to be able to have that for a full month. And lastly, and I don't see one of my doctor friends this morning who asked the question last Sunday, but he said, I read somewhere that members of the army in Germany, the Wehrmacht, were given the privilege of having sexual intercourse with German maidens to produce more Aryan true? And my response was to say, I don't know. I mean, you can know a lot about the Holocaust, but there is never a point where you can say, I know everything. So I thought to myself, boy, that's a question. On the one hand, everything was so diabolical. It would not surprise me if that were the case, but geez, that sounds awfully rotten and terrible to use women as sexual objects just to be baby machines. So maybe it's not true. I looked it up and it's true. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler developed a program called Lebensborn, which basically said that officers, not of the entire army, the Wehrmacht, but officers of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, because you see the selection process was so stringent for them, and they had to be shown to be persons with absolutely no Jewish blood at all. They needed to be la creme de la creme, the cream of the crop. And then German women, certain German maidens were selected also because of their background, and intercourse was encouraged between the SS officers and those persons to produce more babies of the pure Aryan race. So sometimes research really results in some wonderful, uplifting kind of things. You discover another rescuer of Jews that you didn't know about before. That person rescued a few hundred Jews, and isn't that really uplifting and enlightening and delightful? And sometimes research reveals to you things that are rather distressing. So unfortunately, that is the distressing story about the officers of the SS. Well, it's time for us to do things with our official presentation now today. And I've got a lot of things to share, so I need to get really moving very fast. I know the speed limit is 35, and we need to go 50. So here we're going to go. Today, then, the Holocaust lessons to be learned. Oh, David, and look what happened already. It's not advancing. Story the story of my life. Okay, what are we doing wrong in here? And please, if you would, send me a note. You know, my granddaughter sometimes tells me, you know, Grandpa, you don't know anything about computers, do you? And David, I guess I don't know much about them. You touched some magic button and that made it work. I guess this clicker...
I can explain later.
You explain later. This clicker doesn't always work, it seems, so very well. If you walk away with anything from my presentation this morning, it's this particular mantra, it's this particular insight, and that is, how you see influences at the very least and determines at the very most how you will act. This is a matter of what the philosopher Michael Novak calls perspectives or horizons. Maybe you can read the caption there on the cartoon or not, but you can see a man who has a sign that says he's blind. He's walking a dog that is really dead and a skeleton. He's talking to a policeman and he says, "Laziest dog I've ever had." Well, of course, the dog is deceased. Well, in order to organize our world, that is, to make sense of it, to be able to understand it, we put things into categories, oftentimes stereotypes, and then we prejudge people based on images or filters that come to us from our community, from our family, from our religious perspective sometimes, political structures, from the media, from education. So the way we see other persons influences at the very least and determines at the very most how we're going to treat them. So in Nazi Germany, Jews were responsible for everything bad. Everything that was wrong now, everything that's gone wrong in the past. That's how they were perceived. Jews were not like us Germans. They're separate from us. They're different. They have a different appearance, different customs, different diet, different religion, different language. And these differences make them inferior. They're not like us, so we're separate from them, but we demote them and we say that they are inferior. So Jews are then portrayed as thieves and criminals. They're rats, they're lice, they're cockroaches, they're poisonous mushrooms. And this is a very famous book that was put out by the German newspaper publication, Der Stürmer, that basically said, when you are in a field of mushrooms, you need to know which ones are the poisonous ones, right? You can't eat the poisonous ones. That fact actually did Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, in when his host of the evening fed him unknowingly poisonous mushrooms. So Jews may sometimes look a bit like other mushrooms, the rest of us, but we really know they're different and they're poisonous. The way we see other persons influences at the very least and determines at the very most how we will treat them. Think about, as another example, Native Americans. Native Americans were seen as violent, uncivilized savages. In this cartoon, they even debate their brutality among themselves. And they've got a person they're going to dispatch here, and one Indian says, bow and arrow, that's the best way. And Native American in the middle says, no, tomahawk, even better. The one on the right says, ooh, spear favored in best circles. So Native Americans were perceived as brutal and pagan. They were seen as being more animal than human. And these are some depictions from the 19th century. So Indians are different. They're therefore inferior. These lowlifes are immoral. And significantly, our women are at risk. The way we see other persons influences at the very least and determines at the very most how we're going to treat them. Black slaves are seen as naturally inferior. They're less intelligent, less moral, they're less valuable. They're not subjects, they're objects, and they can be disobedient ones. If we see other persons as 3/5 human, and that's what the science in quotation marks at the time evaluated African Americans as being 3/5 human, if they're animalistic, perceived to be evil, they're economically beneficial chattel, that is pieces of property, then we're going to treat them the way we see them. We're going to treat them as inferior. We're going to suppress them for our moral safety, and we're going to relegate them to being pieces of property. And this cartoon came out in 1906. Again, the way we see other persons influences at the very least, determines at the very most how we'll treat them. Another example, if men perceive women as being dependent, inferior, not sufficiently rational, and therefore is not capable of selecting their political leaders, then what happens? They don't have the right to vote. But after courageous protests by suffragettes in the early 1900s, the 19th Amendment in 1920 grants white women in the United States the right to vote. The way we see other persons influences at the very least, determines at the very most how we're going to treat them. The Cold War, how we saw all the Russians. We saw them in ways that were very negative. Russians were seen as evil, they're godless, they're set on world domination, so then we can be prepared to nuke every single one of them. And I always struck in some of the propaganda of the time, both in the Cold War but also in previous times, that when women seem to be, our women seem to be at risk, there's a way of stimulating a very negative kind of reaction. The way we see other persons influences at the very least, determines at the very most how we will treat them. Muslims are sometimes often seen only as terrorists. The 9/11 terrorists were all Muslims, therefore all Muslims must be terrorists. If you can't read the cartoons from the back, the one on the left says, I am so proud of my young son. He wants to be a doctor when he blows up. The one on the right, the male of the family and his spouse and 4 children says, I regret that I have but 5 lives to give for my country. So since we sometimes think that all the Muslims are out to kill us, we better get them first, and we certainly better keep them out of our country. so only Christians can get in. This particular depiction says, Abdul's hobby shop, rockets for all occasions. That's my point. The way we see other people influences at the very least and determines at the very most how we're going to treat them. As an environmentalist, I have to say to you, we tend to see nature as separate from us, below us, so it's there for the taking. That's a clear-cut forest. Since nature is perceived as a vast storehouse of resources available for us to exploit, we do so with an obsession and with hardly any restraint. I'm not sure you can see my photographs so easily from back there, but these are some wildlife, some waterfowl that have been tainted with oil spills. Again, how we see influences at the very least, determines at the very most how we will act. And, in some regarding persons, the way we see other people influences at the very least, determines at the very most how we will treat them. So, how should we Christians see and act toward others? That becomes the bottom line for me as a Christian, maybe for you as well. As Christians, how shall we see other people, and then how shall we treat them? Well, first of all, it seems to me we have to love other people the way that Jesus loves us and other people as well. 1 John chapter 3 says, love is the essence of the gospel. I think also we have to say, we're commanded, we're encouraged, we're lured, we're demanded, we're prodded to love one another as Christ has loved us. From John chapter 15. You might remember if you were at the presentation that talked about the village of Le Chambon in the southern part of France. As you walked into the church, it said above the door, love one another. Of course, it was in French, but love one another. I think also we have to try to see people as children of God. Even people who are remarkably different from us, but see them as children of God. And a quick little story to illustrate it. Mother Teresa died in 1997, and in 1996 I was living in India, and I worked with her, and occasionally I would come to her apartment there at the nunnery. It was number 54A, I remember, and we would do a little talking, and I said to her, because I was overwhelmed by the smells and the sights and the challenges of all the people she was helping out. People who were desperately ill, children who had been thrown into trash bins, babies, and she accepted them all. I get a little emotional talking about this little 4'11" Albanian nun. And I said, how do you do this? How do you see all these things, and you smell all these things, and you hear all these cries. How do you do it? And her answer has always stayed with me. She said, when I see other people, I see the face of God. I see the face of Jesus. Maybe that's what we need to do. To see in other people, even those people who are remarkably different from us, the face of God. The face of Jesus. That's what allowed her to do the work that she did. That's what allowed her to do the work she did. And maybe we have to regard others as our neighbor. All those passages in the scriptures, love thy neighbor as thyself, from Matthew 22, the parable of the Good Samaritan, who's my neighbor anyway? And the answer is anybody that needs your help. Even a dirty, rotten, stinking Jew, because remember the Good Samaritan was not in the sense of being Orthodox Jew. He was one of those who was a half-breed, and so he was not really a good person. So a good Samaritan would be a contradiction in terms, but he helped a Jewish person who was beaten up beside the road because that person was his neighbor. And lastly, I think we have to see other people as our brothers and our sisters. Christians are called to be their brothers and their sisters' keepers in Genesis chapter 4 and in Matthew chapter 25. Someone told me once that they thought the kingdom of God would have fully come to earth if the following situation was the case. If, when comments that were derogatory and sexist about women were offered, men jumped up and they spoke up and they spoke out. Or when persons of color were being discriminated against and treated badly, white folks stood up and protested. When poor people from other countries became oppressed, Americans cried out. Or when other groups were marginalized and their rights were taken away and their lives were threatened, people of goodwill stood up to protest. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because that would be the kingdom of God on earth, wouldn't it? When peace would replace war, when justice would replace unfairness, when love would rule out hate. Wow, that would be the kingdom of God. A couple words about the church's prophet, and I'm concerned here because I want to have time to talk with all of you. The church clearly has as its mission serving the world as Christ served the world. And part of that mission is indeed evangelism, that is, sharing the good news of Jesus and the love and grace of God. Kyle Height's sermon this morning talks about the grace of God, and he entitled his sermon Irresistible. And he was thinking of a variety of ways it was irresistible, and I just had to keep thinking of that Robert Palmer song from years ago, Simply Irresistible. So God's love is simply irresistible. So part of our job is to share our good news about the grace of God. And part of our mission in the world is also benevolence. That is, giving to people who are hungry and needing, not turning a deaf ear, not walking by on the other side of the road, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan. But part of that mission, I think, especially, it's always needed to be the case, but especially in today's world, needs to intentionally be prophecy. And by prophecy, I don't mean forecasting the future. That's not prophecy. But criticizing the things that seem to be wrong. Not letting wrong things go unchallenged. Standing up for justice and identifying with those who have been treated unfairly. This is risky business. In Kyle's sermon this morning, if you were already there at 9, you heard it. If you're going to be there at 11, you'll hear it. He would probably call that costly discipleship. It's costly when you do these things, right? So it is risky business. But I'm wondering, what other group, what other organization, what other force for good can speak to the conscience of society unless it's the church? I think if we don't do that, we have reneged on part of our mission. Eloise, and I know one men's group is studying night, right? Is that going to begin soon? There was some group that was going to be reading Eloise's night. Okay? So I can't help but put him up there, the Nobel Prize winner back in 1986. He said this, and I think he's right. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormentor. This really hits me hard. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. It's not caring. There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. Not sure you can read this quote from Einstein. I took this off of a stone marker when I was visiting my daughter in Boise, Idaho. They have an actual Anna Frank memorial in Boise, Idaho. Well, they tell me I mispronounced it there. It's Boise, in Boise, Idaho. They have this particular thing by Albert Einstein. The world's a dangerous place to live in, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. Oh, this one probably is hard for you to read. This was also at the Anna Frank Memorial. And it's from a survivor whose name is Cain. And he says this: And he's addressing this to teachers. Dear teacher, I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and killed by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is this: help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, or educated Eichmanns. Remember, Adolf Eichmann was the one who engineered the transportation system that took Jews from detention centers to their deaths in concentration camps. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are only important if they serve to make our children more humane. Wow, what a statement that is. And my namesake at Westminster College, C.S. Lewis chair that I occupied for about 10 years, C.S. Lewis said, you know, education can be a little bit dangerous. It just can make us more clever devils. It can just make us more clever devils. This particular shot is of the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise, Idaho. And again, I apologize for my photography, but it has a quote by Ronald Reagan there at the back, behind the sign that talks about Anne Frank and says, "We are everywhere, everywhere, everywhere." And it says, like the genocide of the Armenians before it, and the genocide of the Cambodians which followed it, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten. And my key lesson is the way you see other people influences at the very least and determines at the very most how you're going to treat them. So can we see children of God? Can we see the face of Jesus? Can we love our neighbor? If we can do that, then we can be faithful Christians, and we can also protest the mistreatment of people. I'm almost at the end, so hang in there because I want definitely to save some time before second service. Edmund Burke wrote this, and it's kind of reflection of Einstein as well. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good persons to do nothing. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good persons to do nothing. And my last slide is going to be this. It's a quotation I've used frequently from the Talmud, the collection of 13, 14, 15, depending on how you count them, books of rabbinic commentary on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible in our Old Testament. And it says this: the person who saves one life saves the whole world. The person who saves one life saves the whole world. Some of you may recognize this particular shot from Schindler's List. Did you recognize it? The little girl that wears the red coat. Remember that? The film is black and white. And you see everything in that kind of subdued imagery. But you see this little girl walking across the courtyard. She has on a red coat. And Schindler, played by Liam Neeson in the film, sees that little girl, and tragically, don't want to have any spoilers for you in case you haven't seen the film, at the end of the film, she's clearly identified in one of the bodies that's been stacked up because she's been killed. And what it allows you to do is identify with that one particular person. If you say 6 million people died in the Holocaust who were Jewish, and another 4 at least million people died who were communists, and they were gypsies, that is Roma and Sinti, and they were gay persons, and they were, those just sound like rather large statistics. But if you can identify with one person, it makes it profoundly real. And I was at a meeting with a group of people who were talking with Steven Spielberg, who of course was the director of Schindler's List. Spielberg was a Jewish person who didn't really take his Jewish background, his Jewish ethnicity very serious. But when he directed this film, Schindler's List, it got him really active, and he interviewed tens of thousands of survivors when they were still alive. And so I asked him, I said, why did you have the little girl in the red coat? And his answer stayed with me. I wanted her to be noticed. I wanted her to be noticed. And what he meant by that was, in the midst of all the statistics, which can get pretty non-personal, right? 300 people die in a plane crash. But boy, it's sure different if you knew somebody who was on that plane. A relative, a friend, an acquaintance. So we get acquainted with this little girl in Schindler's List because she has on the red coat. She stands out. And therefore we care in a way about what happened because of that personal connection. And Spielberg said that's the result he wanted. I can say a lot more. I'm not going to, because we need some time to talk. And you can ask any question you want to ask about what I presented this morning, or any other question about any other thing that we've done in these last 9 sessions. And your hand went up first, and then I'll turn back to you, Daryl. Fire away.
A recent book by David Kirkland, The Pope at War, which was written after the release of manuscripts from the Vatican, seems to fit with the theme of today's message. Have you read it first, and if so, what do you think about it?
His comment and question were, there was a book written that talked about the role of Pope Pius XII during the time of the Holocaust, and if I read that book, and how would I evaluate it? Not read that book, but there's a wonderful book on your reading list by a friend of mine who teaches out at the University of the Pacific, Robert Erickson, and it talks about the complicity of the church and the complicity of the university in regard to Hitler, and he's very critical of Pope Pius XII. And Vatican documents have come out that suggest that although he tried to do some things behind the scenes, he never took a kind of official point of view that said, what's happening is wrong, and it really needs to stop, and I call upon all Catholics to resist. Another feature of his papacy, unfortunately, was that he was very much opposed to Hitler, but he was even more opposed to communism. And you may know that Hitler was very much opposed to communism as well. And so what Pius XII and some others did, they designed what were called rat lines, just R-A-T, rat lines, that would transport persons who were perpetrators of the Holocaust from Germany to some safety in South America. So when he was suggested for sainthood 7 or 8 years ago, the Jewish community erupted in protest and said, we don't think, from a Jewish perspective, he deserves to be sainted. So no, I've not read that book, but Pius XII was a very controversial figure in the Holocaust. Darryl, you had a question.
I do have a question, but first I wanted to say a heartfelt thank you for taking the time and effort to give us this marvelous
Thank you. I appreciate that. This is a difficult topic, and I get passionate about it, and as you know from today, I can get emotional about it as well. So thank you for that.
One of the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism comes from the Holocaust deniers and the Holocaust revisionists. I wonder if you can speak a minute to that. Specifically, who are these people, and are they motivated solely by hate, or are there other considerations at play?
Okay. Daryl's observation is that Holocaust deniers and persons who would be Holocaust history revisionists seem to be on the rise, or at least they seem to be still pretty potent, even in American society, and he's wondering where does that come from? Where does it come from? From a Jewish perspective, they see it as one more expression of anti-Semitism. That is a hatred of Jews. There was a famous case at Northwestern University. A professor, I think his name was it Earl or Edward, but his last name was B-U-T-Z. And he wrote a book called The Holocaust, the Greatest Hoax of the 20th Century. And in it he tried to indicate that Jews had fabricated all of this as a part of their goal to take over the world. Well, that's been debunked. But also, more recently, about 5 years ago, a very famous scholar from Emory University down here in Atlanta, Deborah Lipstadt, was taken to court by a person who was a Holocaust denier. And she eventually, after several years in the court system, was shown to be triumphant. So, is it present? Yes, Beryl, it is. Where does it come from? I think it comes from hatred of Jews. It can also come from some envy of Jews, right? Because Jews have oftentimes in their occupational history risen to some positions of economic clout and sometimes some political power. And remember, in the Jewish tradition, when you engage in study, you're actually engaging in worshiping God. So getting advanced degrees, studying, learning of knowledge, that becomes a part of the Jewish experience, and it's rewarded. Jews also, became doctors and lawyers and professors and so forth and so on because that gave them some relative safety and security because these professions are valued by the societies. Unfortunately, Nazi Germany, what they thought was going to be safe, turned out not to be safe, and professors and doctors and attorneys and so forth lost their jobs. One of my friends who died recently was an individual named Michael Vogt, V-O-G-T, lived in Indianapolis, and he showed me one day the number that had been tattooed on the inside of his forearm. And he said, yes, I'm a victim of the greatest hoax of the 20th century. And he just simply pointed to his arm. And I'd say also as a postscript, and we'll get some more questions, anti-Semitism is also on the rise as well, not just Holocaust denial, but also anti-Semitism. And I heard a rabbi speak about that just a couple days ago on the television. And he said, when there are times of unrest, and there are times of social disturbance, and people are pitted against one another, like we are now in our society. I can't remember a time, except maybe back in the Vietnam era, when things were pitted once against the other, and political parties don't think about what's good for the United States, they think about what might further their desire to acquire more power. And in those kinds of times, it seems that certain things come up, and they seem to be kind of percolating up, and they get greater. And that would be things like racism, and sometimes sexism, and I think also anti-Semitism. Yes, to you, and then back to you. Yeah.
Would you speak a moment about white Christian nationalism?
Oh, goodness gracious, you really want me to step on
I think it
Yeah, what she said was, could I speak for just a second about white Christian nationalism? And I can, and it's very dangerous. It's not dangerous for me to talk about it. Well, sometimes it is. I mean, there are times I've said things about it, and my house has gotten spray painted in Indiana, and blah, blah, blah. But my point is that white Christian nationalism basically says white people should be at the top. This nation is ours, and these kinds of immigrants, are really problems for us. And Christianity, since we were founded as a Christian nation, whatever that really means. I mean, our founding fathers were deists; they weren't traditional Christians. But then these persons will indicate they will resort to any means necessary to be able to preserve what they think is white superiority, and then they will do anything they need to try to acquire power and become nationalistic. So I think that's very dangerous. And as a postscript before I get back to you, somebody said to me once, well, you have Muslim friends, aren't you afraid they're going to kill you? And I said, only a few of them. Not many of them. And they say things like, well, aren't all Muslims radical? They're going to want to, and the answer is no, they're not. Radical Islam is just a small percentage of that 1.8 billion Muslims around the planet. And somebody said to me, well, Christians would never do that. And I said, oh, yes, they would. I'll say 3 letters to you. Ku Klux Klan. KKK. View themselves as faithful Christians, that they're going to kill you if you're black, if you're Catholic, if you're whatever else. So radical Islam to Islam would be the same thing to me as the KKK to Christianity. A small group that mess it up for the rest of us. Radical Islam and also the KKK. You were very patient. Thank you.
I just was going to say, isn't what's happening to the Asians now similar to what happened back then?
Oh, thank you very much. Her comment and question is, what's happening with Asians today, is that not similar to some of the other things that are happening? And yes, my examples up here should not be exhaustive. I could have said something about Mexicans, I could have said something about Asians, I could have said something about, and it's clear that violent crimes against Asians are also on the upswing as well, unfortunately. And just a couple weeks ago, we know the story out in California where the Chinese Lunar New Year celebration was interrupted with 10 persons being killed and 10 persons being wounded. So yes, that's on the increase as well.
Yes, in places like colleges and stuff like that.
Say that one more time.
Asians are being discriminated against, like in college entrances and that kind of thing. The way other groups used to be, and maybe still are, but just recently it's become more prominent among the Asian groups who are so successful and work so hard.
Well, it has been. And one of my good friends has 2 adopted Asian Korean children, Angela and Anna, and she could probably speak to that more forcefully than I. Let's just say, a lot of people are different from the majority. And in fact, the majority is quickly losing its numbers. And the number of Hispanic-speaking folks, right? The number of Asians, the number of persons who are increasing in their numbers. And I think what gets dangerous for someone that I would represent, what am I? I'm a white male American. And I've had 3 privileges in my life, undeserved. I mean, I didn't choose to be born white. I didn't choose to be born male. I didn't choose to be born in Zanesville, Ohio. Those were just givens, but those have become advantages. And sometimes persons who are in that position that I would have would feel very threatened with people of color and other individuals around the world. You see where I'm going with that. And with the need to share power with women. That's why I put the example of the women up on the screen. I would have had the right to vote with the Declaration of Independence. And you can do the math, 1776 to 1920, to see when it is that women get the right to vote. So I think there's an insecurity sometimes on the part of people in positions of power who tend to be white, male, and American that has to be confronted, because sometimes the desire to maintain that power and that privilege overrides concern, compassion, love, etc. That's my take on it. Another question maybe. How are we doing for time? Oh, we've got a couple minutes before. I went to first service, so I've already listened to the sermon and I've already worshipped it. Some of you will have to zip away for second service, but note when Kyle talks about costly discipleship, when he says what the church has to be about can sometimes not be risky business, but costly business, because he will quote Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a part of his sermon this morning. Yeah. But a good question maybe, or are we
What about if you talk about, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was looking around to see. There's one question at the back, but we'll take yours first, and then if you'll be patient with me, ma'am, I'll try to take your question in 35 seconds.
When you just talk about the term racism, quote unquote, and anti-Semitism, but that is a form of racism. Am I right on that?
Oh, okay. His comment is, when you say something like racism, and you say anti-Semitism, is anti-Semitism actually racism? Only if you buy Hitler's bifurcation of races into the good guys, the Aryans, and the bad guys, the Jews. In other words, he said Jews were a race. Jews are not a race. They're an ethnicity, but they're not a race. I think I said before, maybe it was down at Montague's restaurant during dinner, there are only 3 races in the world. I am Caucasian. There are Negroid persons, black folks, people of color, and then there are Asians. Right? Only 3 races. And Jews actually represent those 3 races. There are Caucasian Jews, that's probably most of the Jews that we know, but there are African Jews, there are Chinese Jews. So Hitler set it up so that Jews were a race, they were an inferior race. We can't let them intermingle with any other race, especially the Aryan race, because that will pollute it, taint it, add bad blood to it. So in that sense, he thought that anti-Semitism was an issue of race. But from where I'm standing, racism is one particular race putting down another race simply because it's different.